Alright, so frame rates can seem a bit confusing at first. You're setting up your camera for video and you see that it can shoot at, say, 4K at 24 frames per second and HD at 60 or 120 frames per second. You want to shoot something in slow motion, but you're not quite sure how to put that into practice. Well, let's take a look at how to shoot for slow motion as well as how to make it look like slow motion once you get to editing. Hey everyone, Camber here, showing you how to use your camera to make good videos. So if you're new, consider subscribing and also joining my private Facebook group where you can get more personalized help on your filmmaking journey. And lately I've been working on my skateboard moves, so I'm going to show you what these various frame rates look like while skateboarding. And I'm not going to get into the details of why we use common frame rates, but I do have a couple other videos that I'll link in the description that should answer anything that I don't cover here. First off, I'm going to do this double kickflip at the standard 24 frames per second. You see, looks pretty normal. Now I'm going to do it again at 60 frames per second. And you can see, it looks pretty similar, but then you can slow it down and it'll be 2.5 times as long as the original clip. And finally, I'm going to do it one more time at 120 frames per second. You see, still pretty normal, but then we can really slow it down to be 5 times as long as the original shot. So you get that the normal, natural looking speed is 24 frames per second, and the same clip will take 2.5 seconds to complete at 60 frames per second, and 5 seconds to complete at 120 frames per second. And you can figure this out by dividing 24 into 60 and 120. And the higher you go on the frame rate, the more you can slow it down. And something to keep in mind is that you don't want to make really slow movements when you're shooting for slow motion, because then when you do slow it down, it will be way slower than it needs to be. Like here, I'm using 120 frames per second to show grabbing the skateboard, but my movement was too slow, making the shot way too long when slowed down. Now trying again at a normal moving speed yields better results when slowed down, and it helps to tell the story rather than making it drag on. So make normal movements and have your talent move naturally as well so that things look normal in your video and not too slow. Alright, we got our footage, so let's head over to the computer and then I can show you how to actually change it into slow motion. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is open up your editing program. For me, that is Final Cut Pro, and there's really not much to this. What we're going to do is open a new project, and the main thing you have to do here, let's title this example, is make sure that your footage is in a 24 frames per second timeline. It's automatically when you're recording at 23.98, 24, either one of those will work. But it's important to remember that just because you shoot at a frame rate higher than 24 frames per second, that doesn't mean that that footage is slow motion, because you can set a timeline to 60 and it'll give your video a whole different look with those 60 frames per second. You could still use the 120 to do slow motion in that, but you're just going to have a whole different look, and you can watch one of my other videos to see why that is. But 24 frames per second is the normal cinematic look that we're used to seeing. So we click that. Then I'm just going to go in and pick my clips. Alright, so we'll drop the 24 frames per second one in the timeline. I'll make some gaps here. Now I'll get the 60, drop that in as well. And then we'll get one of the 120. So there we have our clips now in there. I'm going to highlight them all and hit Command R. You see it all says 100% because they're all playing at their normal 100% speed. But then, depending on what your program has, just look for something similar. I'm going to click Automatic Speed, and you see it still plays 24 frames per second at the normal rate. Now the 60 frames per second is at 40%, and that makes sense because 40 times 2.5 would be 100, and then the 120 plays out at 20% because 20 times 5 is 100%. And what it's basically doing here is taking every frame and putting one frame in each of those slots for 24 frames per second, because before that it was, if we go back to this, for this it's cutting out 4 of every 5 frames so that it could play it back at real time. And that's why when you look at it frame by frame, you see how crisp each frame looks because it has a higher shutter speed because of the higher frame rate, and so everything is a lot more crisp compared to this 24 frames per second here. When you play it there's a lot more motion blur, and that's why it looks more natural, because this is what we're used to seeing at that 24 frames per second. And then the 60 is in between those. And that's how you do your slow motion. It's a pretty simple process. The big thing to remember is you need to set your project up at 24 frames per second, and then when you pull in those clips, you just slow them down by whatever amount makes sense, whether you're shooting at 60 or 120 or even at 30, you can shoot at that and you hit automatic speed and it's going to bring it down to 80%. And some people use that 30 frames per second slow down to give more of a dreamy type look, because it's not really slow motion, but it's a little bit slower than normal, so it kind of just works in that way. So I hope that clears up any confusion on how to use your DSLR or mirrorless camera for slow motion video. And if you do want to learn more about filmmaking, come join my private Facebook group, Camber Motion Community, where you can interact more with me and others on various filmmaking topics to help you improve your skills. And if this video is helpful, please help me out by leaving a like, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you soon. Oh, and check out how many times I failed trying to land that trick. See?